It was a quiet evening in the small southern town of Maplewood, where life moved at a slow pace and everyone seemed to know each other. The air smelled faintly of pine trees, and the sky was painted orange as the sun began to set behind the distant hills. Deputy Mark Hensley adjusted his hat as he drove his patrol car along the narrow streets of an older neighborhood on the outskirts of town. This part of Maplewood wasn't bustling with activity like the main street downtown. Instead, it was filled with modest homes, some with peeling paint and others with well-kept gardens. It was a place where people lived simple lives, but tonight, something unusual was about to happen. Mark Hensley had been patrolling this area for years, and he prided himself on being thorough, some would even say overly so. He wasn't particularly liked by many in the community, especially not by those who noticed how differently he treated certain people compared to others. Tonight, however, he didn't think much about that. His mind was focused on doing his job, or at least what he believed was his job, keeping order. As he turned onto Elm Street, his eyes caught sight of a car parked awkwardly near a stop sign. The vehicle wasn't moving, and its hazard lights weren't on. Something about it seemed off. Curiosity, and perhaps habit, drove him to pull over behind the car. The red and blue lights of his patrol car flashed as he stepped out, adjusting his belt and grabbing his flashlight. The driver's side window rolled down slowly, revealing a middle-aged black woman sitting calmly behind the wheel. Her name was Evelyn Johnson, though Mark didn't know that yet. She looked up at him with a mixture of confusion and concern, her hands resting gently on the steering wheel. "Good evening, ma'am," Mark said, his tone clipped and formal. "Is everything all right here? Why are you stopped?" Evelyn smiled politely, trying to ease the tension she felt building between them. "Oh, hello, officer. I'm fine, thank you. I just got a little turned around while visiting family. I pulled over to check my GPS because I realized I took a wrong turn." Her explanation sounded reasonable enough, but Mark didn't seem satisfied. He shone his flashlight into the car, inspecting the interior carefully. There were no signs of anything suspicious, just a purse on the passenger seat and a reusable water bottle in the cup holder. But Mark wasn't convinced. To him, there was something about Evelyn's presence that made him uneasy, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Maybe it was the way she spoke, or maybe it was simply the color of her skin. Whatever it was, it clouded his judgment. "Well, ma'am, you shouldn't be stopping in the middle of the road like this," he said sternly, ignoring her attempt to explain herself further. "Do you have your license and registration?" Evelyn nodded and reached for her purse to retrieve the documents. She handed them over without hesitation, her movements deliberate and calm. But Mark barely glanced at them. Instead, he continued to scrutinize her, his gaze lingering longer than necessary. "You seem nervous," he remarked abruptly, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Have you been drinking tonight?" Evelyn blinked in surprise. "Drinking? No, sir, not at all. I don't drink alcohol. I told you, I just got lost." But Mark wasn't listening anymore. In his mind, he had already decided that something was wrong. Perhaps it was easier for him to believe the worst, rather than consider the possibility that Evelyn was telling the truth. Without waiting for further clarification, he instructed her to step out of the car. Evelyn hesitated, unsure of what to do. She had done nothing wrong, yet the situation was escalating quickly. "Please, officer," she said, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. "I promise I haven't broken any laws. Can we just sort this out peacefully?" But Mark wasn't interested in sorting anything out. He had already made up his mind. With a dismissive wave of his hand, he ordered her to exit the vehicle again, this time more forcefully. Reluctantly, Evelyn complied, stepping out onto the pavement. Her heart raced as she watched him take out a pair of handcuffs. Before she could protest, he placed them around her wrists, tightening them just enough to make her uncomfortable. "I'm arresting you on suspicion of driving under the influence," he announced matter-of-factly, as if reading from a script. "You'll have to come with me to the station." Evelyn stared at him in disbelief. How could this be happening? She had followed all the rules, explained her situation clearly, and cooperated fully. Yet here she was, being treated like a criminal. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she held her head high, determined not to give in to fear or anger. As Mark led her to the back of his patrol car, a neighbor happened to peek out of their window, curious about the commotion. They watched silently as Evelyn was placed inside the vehicle, her face etched with a mix of sadness and frustration. Little did anyone know, this incident was about to spark a chain reaction that would shake the entire town and expose truths that some people would rather keep hidden. The drive to the police station was long and silent. Evelyn sat in the back seat, staring out the window as the familiar streets passed by. Her thoughts raced, wondering how this misunderstanding could spiral so far out of control. Meanwhile, Mark remained stoic, gripping the steering wheel tightly as if trying to convince himself that he had done the right thing. But deep down, a tiny voice whispered otherwise, a voice he chose to ignore for now. By the time they arrived at the station, word of the arrest had already begun to spread. A bystander had captured part of the interaction on their phone and uploaded it to social media. Within minutes, comments poured in, questioning Mark's actions and expressing support for Evelyn. What started as a routine traffic stop had suddenly become much bigger than either of them could have imagined. And as the night wore on, the consequences of Mark's decision would reveal themselves in ways he never anticipated. The Maplewood police station was a modest brick building tucked away on the edge of town, far enough from the main street to avoid drawing too much attention, but close enough for convenience. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting a sterile glow over the worn furniture and faded posters about community safety. The air smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning supplies, a mix that somehow managed to feel both comforting and unsettling at the same time. Deputy Mark Hensley walked Evelyn Johnson into the station, his grip firm on her arm, as if she might try to escape. She didn't resist. There was no point in fighting back when she knew she hadn't done anything wrong. Still, every step felt heavier than the last, each movement chipping away at her dignity. Her handcuffs jingled softly with each stride, a sound that echoed through the nearly empty hallway like an accusation. At the front desk, Officer Clara Davis looked up from her paperwork, her pen pausing mid-sentence. Clara was newer to the force, younger and less jaded than most of her colleagues. She had always tried to approach her job with kindness and fairness, but tonight, something about the scene unfolding before her made her uneasy. Evelyn's calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to Mark's rigid posture and clipped tone. It was clear that this wasn't just another routine booking. "Clara, get the intake forms ready," Mark barked, not bothering to explain why Evelyn was there or even glance at his coworker. He guided Evelyn toward one of the chairs near the processing area, where she sat quietly, her hands still cuffed behind her back. Clara hesitated for a moment, then nodded and turned to gather the necessary documents. As she worked, she couldn't help but steal glances at Evelyn, whose quiet composure seemed almost otherworldly given the circumstances. While Clara prepared the paperwork, Mark began reciting the details of the arrest out loud, his voice carrying an undertone of irritation. Suspect pulled over for erratic driving, refused to comply with basic commands, exhibited signs of impairment. His words trailed off as he scribbled notes onto a clipboard, embellishing the story to fit his narrative. Evelyn listened silently, her jaw tightening slightly but her expression otherwise unreadable. She knew better than to argue. It wouldn't change anything, and it certainly wouldn't make Mark reconsider his actions. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the room grew palpable. Other officers drifted in and out, some stopping briefly to see what was going on. A few exchanged wary glances, their faces betraying a mix of discomfort and unease. They weren't strangers to questionable arrests. Maplewood had its share of controversies, but something about this particular case felt different. Maybe it was Evelyn's age. At 62, she hardly fit the profile of someone who would cause trouble. Or maybe it was the way Mark kept muttering under his breath, making snide remarks about people like her while pretending no one could hear him. One officer, a man named Greg, leaned against the wall and watched the scene unfold with growing concern. He had worked with Mark long enough to know how he operated, and tonight's behavior was par for the course. But that didn't mean Greg agreed with it. In fact, He often found himself biting his tongue around Mark, afraid of rocking the boat or drawing unwanted attention. Tonight, though, he struggled to stay silent. "You sure about this, Hensley?" Greg finally asked, his tone cautious but firm. "She doesn't exactly look like someone who's drunk or dangerous." Mark shot him a glare, his lips curling into a sneer. "You questioning my judgment, Greg? Because I don't need your opinion, right now. Just do your job." Greg raised his hands in mock surrender, backing off without another word. He knew better than to push further. It wasn't worth the headache. But as he returned to his desk, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were all complicit in something bigger than themselves. By staying quiet, weren't they enabling Mark's behavior? The thought gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside, telling himself there was nothing he could do. Not tonight, anyway. Meanwhile, outside the station, the world was beginning to take notice. Unbeknownst to anyone inside, a bystander who had witnessed part of the traffic stop had uploaded a video clip to social media. The footage wasn't perfect. It was grainy and shaky, captured from a distance, but it showed enough to spark outrage. In the dim light of the patrol car's flashing lights, viewers could see Evelyn calmly explaining herself to Mark, only to be ignored and ultimately handcuffed. The video spread quickly, shared hundreds of times within minutes. Comments flooded in, ranging from disbelief to anger. "What is going on in Maplewood?" one user wrote. "This poor woman did nothing wrong. She's being treated like a criminal because of the color of her skin," another chimed in. "This has to stop." Hashtags like "Mar Justice for Evelyn" and "Our End Police Brutality" began trending locally, drawing attention not just from residents of Maplewood, but from neighboring towns as well. People started calling the station, demanding answers. Some even showed up in person, standing outside with signs and chanting slogans. The small police department, unaccustomed to such scrutiny, was caught off guard. Back inside, Evelyn remained, composed despite the chaos swirling around her. She had spent decades navigating difficult situations with grace and resilience, and tonight was no exception. While Mark continued to fill out paperwork, she focused on maintaining her composure, refusing to let his hostility break her spirit. Occasionally, she glanced at Clara, who offered her a sympathetic smile whenever their eyes met. It was a small gesture, but it meant more than Clara realized. As the hours dragged on, Evelyn's thoughts drifted to her family. What would they think when they heard about this? Would they worry? Would they be angry? She hoped they would understand that she hadn't done anything to deserve this treatment. But deep down she knew that this incident wasn't just about her. It was about something much larger. It was about the systemic issues that allowed moments like these to happen in the first place. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the booking process was complete. Mark led Evelyn to a holding cell, unlocking the door with a metallic clink that echoed through the quiet corridor. She stepped inside without protest, taking a seat on the narrow bench along the wall. The cell was cold and sparse, its concrete walls offering little comfort. Yet even here, Evelyn radiated a quiet strength, her presence commanding respect despite her surroundings. Mark locked the door behind her and turned to leave, but not before muttering one final remark under his breath. "You'll have plenty of time to think about what you did," he said, his tone dripping with smug satisfaction. Evelyn didn't respond. Instead, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, letting the weight of the evening settle over her. She knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. And as the first rays of dawn began to creep through the barred window high above her head, she resolved to face whatever came next, with the same courage and dignity that had carried her this far. The early morning light filtered through the thin curtains of Sheriff Marcus Johnson's home, casting soft golden streaks across the living room. Marcus had always been an early riser, a habit ingrained in him during his years of service in law enforcement. But today he wasn't sipping coffee or reviewing reports like he usually did. Instead, he sat slumped on the edge of his couch, staring at his phone in disbelief. The screen displayed dozens of notifications, texts, calls, and messages flooding in from family, friends, and concerned citizens alike. Each one carried variations of the same shocking news. His mother, Evelyn Johnson had been arrested. At first, Marcus thought it was some kind of cruel prank. His mother? Arrested? It didn't make sense. Evelyn was the kind of person who went out of her way to help others, who greeted everyone with a warm smile and a kind word. She baked cookies for neighbors, volunteered at church fundraisers, and never hesitated to offer advice when asked. The idea of her being dragged into a police station in handcuffs felt surreal, almost impossible to comprehend. But as he scrolled through the messages and saw the video clip that had gone viral, reality hit him like a punch to the gut. In the video, Evelyn looked calm but frustrated, explaining herself to a deputy whose body language screamed hostility. Marcus recognized the officer immediately. It was Mark Hensley, a name that had surfaced more than once in complaints about misconduct. Marcus's jaw tightened as he replayed the clip, his mind racing with questions. What had happened? Why? Hadn't anyone intervened? And most importantly, where was his mother now? Without wasting another second, Marcus grabbed his keys and headed to the station. He didn't bother changing out of his casual clothes, a plain t-shirt and jeans, and he certainly didn't stop to think about how this might look to others. All that mattered was finding Evelyn and getting answers. When Marcus arrived at the police station, the scene outside caught him off guard. A small crowd had gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for Evelyn," and "Respect our elders." Some people recognized him as he approached, whispering his name and nodding in solidarity. Marcus offered them a brief, grateful smile before pushing open the heavy glass doors and stepping inside. The atmosphere within the station was tense, though quieter than he expected. Officers moved around cautiously, avoiding eye contact with each other or pretending to be busy with paperwork. Clara Davis, the young officer who had processed Evelyn's booking, looked up nervously when she saw Marcus enter. Her eyes widened slightly and she quickly turned back to her desk, fumbling with papers as if trying to appear occupied. Marcus didn't say anything at first. He scanned the room until his gaze landed on the holding area. Through the barred window of one of the cells, he spotted Evelyn sitting on the bench, her posture upright and composed despite the situation. For a moment, all he could do was stare, his chest tightening with a mix of anger and relief. Anger because his mother was sitting in a jail cell for no valid reason. Relief because she appeared unharmed, her quiet strength shining even in the dim lighting. "Mom," Marcus called softly, his voice breaking slightly. Evelyn turned her head sharply, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw him standing there. For the first time since her arrest, her composure faltered. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly, forcing a small smile. "Marcus," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it, "I didn't want you to find out like this." Before Marcus could respond, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Mark Hensley appeared, clipboard in hand, looking every bit as smug as he had in the video. When he saw Marcus, however, his expression shifted. His confident stride faltered and his face paled slightly. It was clear he hadn't anticipated running into the sheriff himself. "Sheriff Johnson," Mark began, his tone overly formal as he tried to regain control of the situation. "I can explain." "You'll explain everything," Marcus interrupted, his voice low but firm. "But first, unlock that door." Mark hesitated, glancing between Marcus and Evelyn as if unsure what to do next. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he fumbled with his key ring and unlocked the cell door. Evelyn stepped out slowly, brushing non-existent dust from her clothes as if reclaiming her dignity with every movement. She gave Mark a long, measured look before turning to embrace her son. "I'm fine, Marcus," she whispered, though her trembling hands betrayed her attempt to downplay the ordeal. "Don't let this ruin your day." But Marcus wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet. He turned his attention back to Mark, who was visibly sweating now. "Start talking," Marcus demanded. "Why is my mother here?" Mark swallowed hard, his earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of Marcus's glare. She was pulled over for erratic driving, Sheriff. I thought she might be impaired. She wasn't cooperating. That's not true." Evelyn interjected calmly, cutting him off. "I told him I was lost and stopped to check my GPS. I cooperated fully, Marcus. He didn't listen. Marcus's nostrils flared as he processed her words. He turned back to Mark, his patience wearing thin. Did you run a sobriety test? Did you check her car for evidence of wrongdoing? Or did you just assume the worst? Based on assumptions, Mark stammered, unable to form a coherent response. Around them, the other officers pretended to focus on their tasks, though it was clear they were listening intently. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Get your things together, Marcus said finally, his voice cold and authoritative. You're suspended pending investigation, and trust me, we will get to the bottom of this. Mark's face flushed red, embarrassment and fear warring for dominance. He opened his mouth to argue but thought better of it. Without another word, he retreated to his desk, his hands shaking as he gathered his belongings. Meanwhile, Evelyn placed a gentle hand on Marcus's arm. Let's go home, son, she said softly. We can talk about everything later. Marcus nodded, though his mind was already working overtime. As they walked out of the station together, the crowd outside erupted into applause. People cheered and clapped, offering words of support and admiration for Evelyn's resilience. Marcus forced a smile, waving briefly before helping his mother into his car. The drive home was quiet, both of them lost in thought. Evelyn stared out the window, watching the familiar streets pass by as if seeing them for the first time. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with suppressed anger. He wanted to scream, to demand justice right then and there, but he knew better. This wasn't just about his mother anymore, it was about something much bigger. It was about accountability, fairness, and ensuring that no one else had to endure what Evelyn had experienced. When they arrived home, Evelyn excused herself to freshen up, leaving Marcus alone in the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, running, a hand over his face as he exhaled deeply. His phone buzzed incessantly on the table, reporters and local leaders reaching out for statements. He ignored them for now, knowing he needed to gather his thoughts before addressing the public. As the hours passed, the story continued to spread, drawing national attention. News outlets picked up the viral video, framing it as yet another example of systemic bias within law enforcement. Calls for reform grew louder, and pressure mounted on the department to take action. By mid-afternoon, the mayor had issued a statement calling for transparency and accountability, while state officials announced plans to investigate the incident. For you, Marcus, the day stretched on endlessly, each moment bringing new challenges and decisions. But through it all, one thing remained constant: his determination to ensure that his mother's ordeal would serve as a catalyst for change. Whatever happened next, he vowed to fight, not just for Evelyn, but for everyone who deserved to be treated with respect and fairness. The moment Sheriff Daniel Johnson walked into the police station, the air seemed to grow heavier. Everyone could feel the tension radiating off him as he strode toward the holding area, where his mother, Evelyn, was still sitting quietly in a cold, uncomfortable cell. His jaw was clenched and his eyes burned with a mix of disbelief and fury. When he finally saw Evelyn, his kind, gentle mother, handcuffed and looking so out of place in that harsh environment, it took every ounce of self-control not to explode. On the spot, Daniel knelt beside her, his voice trembling slightly as he asked, "Mom, are you okay?" Evelyn nodded, trying to reassure him with a faint smile, though her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. She didn't want drama. She just wanted to go home. But Daniel knew this wasn't something they could sweep under the rug. He stood up abruptly, his towering frame drawing attention from everyone in the room. Then, without hesitation, he turned to Officer Greg Hargrove, who had been nervously lingering nearby. "What exactly happened here tonight?" Daniel demanded, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. Hargrove fumbled for words, stammering through half-baked explanations about how Evelyn fit the description of someone reported earlier in the evening. The problem? No one else at the station had received any such report. In fact, when pressed further, Hargrove admitted he couldn't even recall what the supposed suspect looked like or why he thought Evelyn matched it. His excuses grew weaker by the second, and soon, He was reduced to awkward silence, unable to meet Daniel's piercing gaze. Evelyn watched the exchange silently, her heart aching more for her son than for herself. She knew how much Daniel valued fairness and integrity within his department, and seeing him confront blatant misconduct firsthand must have felt like a betrayal. Still, she remained composed, refusing to let anger take hold. Instead, she focused. On the bigger picture, this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about exposing the flaws in a system that allowed people like Hargrove to abuse their power. Word of the incident spread quickly, thanks in part to Deputy Marcus Johnson, who couldn't stay quiet after witnessing his brother's reaction. By morning, the story had reached local news outlets, sparking outrage across the community. Reporters swarmed the police station, eager to get details about the arrest of a respected elder whose only crime seemed to be driving while black. Protesters gathered outside holding signs that read "Justice for Evelyn" and "End racial profiling now." The town buzzed with conversations about accountability, trust, and reform. Back inside the station, things weren't going well for Hargrove. Once the initial shock wore off, reality set in. He'd made a catastrophic mistake, and there was no way to undo it. His colleagues avoided eye contact with him, embarrassed by his behavior and worried about how it reflected on the department. Even those who might have shared some of his biases privately were quick to distance themselves. Now, after all, no one wanted to be associated with the officer who arrested the sheriff's mother based on nothing more than prejudice. The internal investigation into Hargrove's actions moved swiftly. Investigators reviewed body cam footage from the traffic stop, which painted a damning picture. On tape, Hargrove came across as dismissive and condescending, interrupting Evelyn whenever she tried to explain herself. He ignored basic protocols, skipped routine questions, and jumped straight to accusations. Worse yet, the review uncovered a troubling pattern. Multiple complaints against him over the years alleging racial profiling and aggressive conduct. Most had been brushed aside or buried, but now they resurfaced, adding weight to the case against him. As the evidence mounted, Hargrove became increasingly desperate. He tried to defend himself, claiming he was just following procedure and insisting he hadn't meant any harm. But his weak attempts at justification fell flat. Even his superiors, who might have once turned a blind eye to his behavior, realized they couldn't protect him this time. Public pressure was too intense and the department's reputation was on the line. Within days, Hargrove was suspended without pay, pending formal disciplinary action. While Hargrove faced consequences for his actions, Evelyn found herself thrust into an unexpected role, that of a symbol of resilience and change. Strangers approached her at church, grocery stores, and community events, sharing their own stories of mistreatment by law enforcement. Many expressed admiration for how gracefully she handled the situation, despite the humiliation and fear she must have felt. Evelyn listened to each person with empathy, nodding along and offering words of encouragement. Slowly, she began to see an opportunity in her ordeal, not just for personal healing but for broader impact. Her sons, Daniel and Marcus, supported her decision to speak out. Together, they organized a town hall meeting to address the issues raised by the incident. Dozens of residents attended, filling the room with a mix of frustration, hope, and determination. Evelyn took the stage, her voice steady and clear as she recounted her experience. She spoke candidly about feeling targeted because of her race, and urged others to join her in advocating for meaningful reforms. "We can't change the past," she said, pausing to look around the room, "but we can work together to create a future where no one has to endure what I went through, where justice is truly blind and respect is given freely, regardless of skin color." Her words resonated deeply with the crowd, igniting a collective commitment to action. Inspired by Evelyn's courage, the town implemented several changes aimed at improving police-community relations. Mandatory diversity training programs were introduced for all officers, focusing on recognizing implicit bias and fostering empathy. A citizen oversight board was established to ensure transparency and accountability within the department. And perhaps most importantly, open dialogues between residents and law enforcement became a regular occurrence, helping to bridge divides and build mutual understanding. For Evelyn, these developments brought a sense of closure. Though the incident had shaken her faith in humanity temporarily, the overwhelming support she received restored her belief in the goodness of people. She continued attending church, baking cookies for neighbors, and participating in community initiatives, living proof that kindness and grace could inspire lasting change. As for Hargrove, his departure from the town marked the beginning of a long journey toward redemption, or at least reckoning with the damage he'd caused. In the end, what started as a shameful mistake transformed into a catalyst for progress. Evelyn's story reminded everyone that even in moments of injustice, there is always room for growth, compassion, and transformation. Evelyn Johnson's story didn't end with the arrest or even the public outcry that followed. Instead, it became a turning point, not just for her family, but for the entire town. After the initial shock and anger subsided, Evelyn found herself reflecting deeply on what had happened. She wasn't someone who sought attention or enjoyed being in the spotlight, but she realized that her experience could serve a greater purpose. Her quiet strength and determination to make things right inspired those around her, including her sons Daniel and Marcus. The day after the town hall meeting, Evelyn woke up feeling both exhausted and hopeful. The night before had been emotionally draining, yet she felt a sense of fulfillment knowing that so many people were willing to listen and take action. As she sipped her morning coffee, she thought about how far they'd come in such a short time. Just days ago, she had been sitting in a cold police cell, feeling humiliated and powerless. Now she was at the center of a movement aimed at creating real change. Her phone buzzed constantly throughout the day, with messages pouring in from friends, neighbors, and even strangers thanking her for speaking out. Some shared their own stories of discrimination, while others simply expressed admiration for her courage. Evelyn responded to each message personally, offering words of encouragement and gratitude. She made it a point to let everyone know that their voices mattered, and that together they could push for progress. Meanwhile, Sheriff Daniel Johnson worked tirelessly to rebuild trust between the community and his department. He knew that one incident couldn't undo years of systemic issues, but he was determined to start somewhere. Every morning he held meetings with his officers to discuss the changes being implemented. Mandatory diversity training sessions began immediately, led by experts who specialized in addressing implicit bias and fostering empathy. These workshops weren't easy. Some officers resisted at first, uncomfortable with confronting their own prejudices. But over time, attitudes began to shift. Daniel also introduced regular check-ins between officers and community members, creating opportunities for open dialogue. At these gatherings, residents could voice their concerns directly to law enforcement officials, and officers could explain their procedures and challenges. These conversations weren't always smooth. There were moments of tension and disagreement, but they helped humanize both sides. People started seeing each other as individuals rather than stereotypes, and that made all the difference. Deputy Marcus Johnson played a crucial role in these efforts as well. Known for his calm demeanor and ability to connect with people, Marcus became a bridge between the department and the community. He spent hours visiting local schools, churches, and community centers, listening to people's fears and frustrations. He encouraged them to participate in the new initiatives, assuring them that their input would shape the future of policing in the town. As weeks turned into months, the changes started to show. Officers began patrolling neighborhoods not just to enforce laws but to build relationships. They stopped to chat with shopkeepers, played basketball with kids at the park, and attended community events. Residents noticed the difference and responded positively. Slowly but surely, the atmosphere shifted from one of suspicion and fear to one of cooperation and mutual respect. For Evelyn, the most rewarding part of this journey was watching her community come together. She threw herself into advocacy work, joining local organizations focused on racial equality and social justice. She spoke at conferences, wrote op-eds for newspapers, and mentored young activists eager to learn from her experiences. Her message was simple: change starts with compassion. She urged people to look beyond differences and find common ground, reminding them that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. Despite the progress, Evelyn knew there was still much work to be done. Racism and bias weren't problems that could be solved overnight. They required constant vigilance and effort. But she remained optimistic, believing that every small step forward counted. She often told her grandchildren, "You don't have to fix everything at once, just do your part and trust that others will too." One evening, several months after the incident, Evelyn stood on the porch of her home, watching the sun set over the quiet neighborhood where she'd lived for decades. It was hard to believe how much had changed since that fateful night when Officer Hargrove pulled her over. Back then, she'd felt like an outsider in her own town. Now, she felt embraced by it. Neighbors waved as they passed by, some stopping to chat or drop off homemade dishes. Children played freely in the streets, laughing without a care in the world. Inside the house, her family gathered around the dining table, sharing stories and laughter. Daniel joked about the latest antics of his officers while Marcus teased him about finally learning how to delegate tasks. Evelyn smiled, soaking in the warmth of the moment. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly at peace. Later that week, the town celebrated its annual Unity Day festival, a tradition that had taken on new significance in light of recent events. This year, the event featured speeches, performances, and workshops centered around themes of inclusivity and understanding. Evelyn was invited to give the keynote address, and though she initially hesitated, she ultimately agreed. Standing on stage in front of hundreds of people, she spoke from the heart. "I never imagined I'd be standing here today," she began, her voice steady and clear. "When I think back to that night, I remember feeling scared, hurt, and angry. But I also remember thinking, this can't be the end of the story." And it wasn't. Because of you, all of you, we've turned something painful into something powerful. We've shown that love and kindness can overcome hate and fear. The crowd erupted in applause, many rising to their feet. Evelyn wiped away tears as she looked out at the sea of smiling faces. In that moment, she realized that her story wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had chosen to stand with her to fight for a better future. It was about a town that refused to stay divided, even when it would have been easier to give up. As the festival continued, Evelyn wandered through the bustling crowds, stopping to greet familiar faces and meet new ones. A group of teenagers approached her, asking if she'd sign copies of the article she'd written about her experience. She obliged, adding personal notes of encouragement to each one. Nearby, a choir sang songs of hope and unity, their voices blending beautifully against the backdrop of twinkling lights. By the end of the evening, Evelyn felt a profound sense of gratitude for her family, her community, and the resilience of the human spirit. She knew that challenges lay ahead, but she also knew they would face them together. As she walked home under the starlit sky, arm in arm with Daniel and Marcus, she whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. Life had tested her, but it had also given her the chance to make a difference, and for that, she would always be grateful. The story of Evelyn Johnson wasn't just one of injustice, it was one of triumph, healing, and hope. It reminded everyone who heard it that even in the darkest moments, light could break through. All it took was courage, compassion, and a willingness to believe in a brighter tomorrow.